Teenage Nightmares, Haunted Road Story Compilation. Hello, my name is Joseph. My story takes place a few years ago. I was driving up to Maine to visit my aunt and uncle for Thanksgiving. It was only a 2-hour drive, but to reach their house, I had to take Highway 2A, a road notorious for being both dangerous and haunted. Its reputation came partly from the sharp bends and icy roads, which made it treacherous to navigate. Not to mention the countless drivers who had lost their lives on that very highway. I was home alone. My mom and dad were in Alaska visiting my sister, so I decided to leave the night before Thanksgiving to help with cooking and to avoid the holiday traffic. Plus, both of their sons, my cousins, who I'd grown up with, were flying in that evening. We hadn't seen each other in years, so we planned to meet up that night, excited to all be in the same house again, staying up late and hanging out just like old times. With that thought in mind, I headed home from work, excited for the trip. My bags were already packed. All I needed to do was stop for gas, and I'd be on my way. About an hour later, I found myself nearing Route 2A. My heart always skipped a beat when entering that highway. But something about that night felt even creepier than usual. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I'd always been uneasy about this road. My uncle, who was a truck driver, had nearly died on it 20 years earlier. It was a cold December night, so he had stopped for what he thought was a woman standing on the side of the highway. It was cold and snowing, so he couldn't just leave her out there. He told us that when he got out of his truck to help her, she vanished into the night. As he was walking back to his truck, he claimed he felt a force shove him onto the highway, just as a pickup truck came speeding toward him. He barely managed to jump out of the way, missing the truck by mere inches. I don't know if it was my uncle's story or the countless others, but somewhere along the line, I grew wary of this road. With all those tales in mind, I never expected that one day I'd have my own story to tell. It only took 45 minutes of driving on that highway before I saw him. At first, I thought it was a man in distress. His face was bloody, and his clothes were torn. I pulled over and got out to help. His face no longer held the look of someone in need. Instead, a menacing grin stretched from ear to ear. I nervously asked if he needed help, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with that horrifying grin. As he got within a few feet of me, I could see just how wrong this guy was. His eyes were like deep, endless voids, and his body was covered in cuts and wounds that no human could survive. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew deep down that this wasn't a person. Without thinking, I bolted back to my car and sped off, my heart racing in my chest. I made it about 5 miles up the highway before my car started to sputter. The engine coughed and choked, then suddenly stalled. I was stuck, completely stranded on the side of Route 2A. Panicked, I called AAA, but they told me it would be a few hours before anyone could get to me. I was legitimately stuck. About 30 minutes had passed when I saw him again, this time, walking up the highway, heading straight for me. My blood ran cold, and I froze in place. I didn't know if he was coming to kill me, to haunt me, or something worse. All I knew was that I was terrified, and there was nowhere to run. But then I hesitated. What if I was overthinking it? Maybe he really was just hurt, lucky to even be alive. The thought gnawed at me, the guilt tightening like a vice around my chest. I couldn't just leave him there. Against every screaming instinct in my head, I turned and began walking toward him. I was about 5 feet away when I asked again, "Do you need help?" This time, he nodded. The simple gesture filled me with a mix of relief and disbelief. How could I have been so close to leaving this poor man to die, stranded on the side of a freezing highway? The thought made my stomach twist, the cold biting deeper, now that guilt had crept in. I told him he could wait in my car, adding that it wasn't starting. He didn't respond, didn't even nod, just turned and walked straight to my car without a word. As he slipped into the passenger seat, the silence felt heavier than the cold. Something about his stillness, his quiet compliance, sent an uneasy chill down my spine. Then, without a word, He raised a hand and pointed at my ignition. It was an odd gesture, almost commanding, but something about it compelled me to turn the key. I don't know why I listened, but when I did, the engine roared to life on the first try. I'd be lying if I said my heart didn't sink a bit. I mean, the car hadn't even sputtered moments ago. "Don't worry," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I'll get you to an ER right away." He nodded again, silent as ever, his face unreadable. That same chill crept over me, but I pushed it aside. He needed help, didn't he? I started driving, the hum of the engine almost comforting after everything that had just happened. The nearest hospital was about 30 minutes away, and I focused on the road, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. About 15 minutes in, my headlights caught a figure up ahead, a woman in a flowing white dress, standing by the side of the road. She looked as stranded as the man beside me had been. Without thinking, I pulled over. I glanced at the man beside me as I unbuckled my seatbelt. "I'll just be a few minutes," I said, my voice firm but uneasy. "I'm going to see if she needs help." After a brief pause, he turned slowly, his movements unnervingly deliberate, and locked eyes with me. For the first time since I'd picked him up, there was something there, something cold and knowing. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion that felt more like a warning than a refusal. It wasn't just a no. It was as if he was telling me she wasn't the one in danger. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't just leave her out there in the dark. Ignoring his warning, I reached for the door handle. Before I could pull it, his hand shot out and grabbed mine, his grip cold and unyielding. He shook his head again, this time with more force, his eyes wide with something I could only describe as fear. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. Before he could answer, I glanced back at the woman and froze. She was at my door, her hands clawing at the handle, her face twisted into something inhuman. Her eyes burned with fury, her lips stretched into a grotesque snarl. My breath caught in my throat as I realized she wasn't just angry. She wanted in. My instincts took over. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, the tires screeching against the pavement as I sped away. The woman's distorted face vanished into the darkness behind me, but the image burned itself into my mind. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they ached, and my pulse pounded in my ears. It wasn't until I'd put at least 20 miles between us and that horrifying scene that I finally dared to glance at the man beside me, to thank him for the warning. But when I turned to look at him, my blood ran cold. The seat was empty. He was gone. I pulled over, frantically searching the car, but there was no trace of him, no sign he'd ever been there. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Shaken but alive, I made it to my aunt's house for Thanksgiving, the warmth of the gathering a stark contrast to the icy fear still gripping me. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened on that drive. Somehow, I knew they wouldn't believe me, or worse, they might ask questions I didn't want to answer. I believe that man saved me that night from something far worse than just a terrifying encounter. The more I think about it, the more I'm certain he'd crossed paths with that woman before and paid the price for it. He couldn't let it happen again. It's almost like he watches over the drivers who pass through that stretch of road, guiding them, warning them. A protector in a place where no one's safe. And maybe, just maybe, that's why he never spoke, why he never stayed. He was just there long enough to do what needed to be done. So, to the kind spirit on Route 2A, I thank you. I'll never forget how you saved me from a fate I couldn't escape on my own. Story number 2, Donner's Pass. Hello, my name is Marcus. I live in a small town called Nevada City, California. It's quiet here. Nothing much ever happens. But just an hour's drive away lies Donner's Pass, where my story takes place, a place steeped in tragic history. Growing up, I was obsessed with its dark past, spending countless hours researching every detail. Yet, despite my fascination, I'd never actually been there. Not until a few years ago, a decision I've come to regret deeply. It was my 20th birthday. My parents were both away on business trips, and my only friend in town was ironically out of town. With no one around, I figured it was the perfect time to finally visit Donner's Pass and explore it. So, I grabbed my keys, hopped in my Jeep, and set off on the hour-long drive. That excitement and eagerness wouldn't last long. It would soon twist into something else entirely: fear. When I arrived, I pulled into a small parking spot and decided to hike the rest of the way. The tracks and tunnels were my main destination, so I headed in that direction, taking in the eerie silence of the place. I was the only person there. Along the way, I stopped to inspect the graffiti and carvings that covered the old stone walls, signs of others who had ventured here before me. I stopped and pulled out my Swiss Army knife, deciding to carve my initials into the historic walls of Donner Pass. The cool metal felt steady in my hand as I etched the first two letters, but just as I was about to carve the last, a sound froze me in place. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around slowly, certain someone was behind me, and I was right. Standing a few feet away was a man dressed like a cowboy, hat, boots, and all. Unease prickled at the back of my neck as I raised a hand in a small wave, trying to show I meant no harm. He didn't wave back. He just stood there, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. I took that as my cue to leave. I'd already been exploring for about an hour, and honestly, I was ready to head home anyway. Without another word, I turned and started walking back through the tunnel, heading toward my Jeep. But as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned my head, hoping to reassure myself that the guy wasn't following me. But to my shock, he was only about 10 feet behind me. My heart skipped a beat when I saw he was holding what looked like a machete, casually swinging it around as if it were nothing more than a toy. I picked up my pace, and to my horror, he did the same. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a full sprint, hearing his footsteps pounding behind me, getting closer with each passing second. I finally reached the tunnel's exit, but my Jeep was still a good 15-minute walk away. To make things worse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the path ahead. And now, this man was chasing me, machete in hand, his every step growing louder. I pushed myself to run faster, my breath ragged in my chest. Suddenly, I heard the sharp whoosh of air. He'd thrown the machete. It sailed past my head, missing me by mere inches. Then, he started laughing. It was the most evil, bone-chilling laugh I'd ever heard. His voice followed, screaming that he was going to gut me like a little pig. Fear surged through me, and I ran faster than I ever thought I could, a wild man desperate for escape. Finally, I reached my Jeep, threw open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. I tore off, tires screeching against the gravel as I sped away like a madman. Only when I felt the distant hum of safety did I dare to pull over. My hands shook as I dialed the police. I told the police everything, and they launched a search of the area. It didn't take them long to find him, only a few hours. In fact, they discovered the bodies of 3 people, their remains just a little deeper in the tunnel, not far from where I'd encountered him. It turns out he was a 45-year-old man with severe mental illness, who had recently escaped from a psych ward. The police told me I was lucky to have escaped. The man stood nearly 6 feet 7 inches and weighed over 300 pounds. I, on the other hand, was only 5 feet 8 inches and 165 pounds. If he had caught me, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. Since that day, I never go exploring alone anymore, and I doubt I ever will again. Story number 3, The Drive Home. Hi, my name's Earl, and today I'm going to tell you about the most terrifying night of my life. To fully understand, I need to take you back to 2003. I was attending Boston College at the time, and I'd just finished finals. Looking forward to the break and the time off from college. The drive home for Christmas should have been simple enough, just a few hours down the road. If only I knew what waited for me on Clinton Road. To give you some context, Clinton Road is a highway I drive on to get home. And by home, I mean Milford, New Jersey. If you don't know what Clinton Road is, well, I suggest you look it up. Growing up, I'd always hear the stories about it, the ghost sightings, the strange occurrences, but I never experienced anything myself. Me and my friends would even mess around on the old bridge, daring each other to be the first to cross it at night. It was always just stories, until that night. The first few hours were fine. Besides the snow and the icy roads, it was a smooth drive. I cruised along, listening to a mix of CDs, just soaking in the peace, the open road, and the solitude. There's something about driving alone at night, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of snow beneath the tires, that really puts your mind at ease. Eventually, I found myself on Clinton Road. It was about a 5-mile stretch to my parents' house, but as soon as I turned onto that road, something changed. A wave of nausea hit me, not the kind you get with the flu or food poisoning, but something different. I can't really explain it, but it was a feeling unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Something deep in my gut told me this wasn't a normal kind of sick. It was like I could sense something evil, something dark approaching. I felt it. The air in the car seemed to shift, and then just like that, my car stalled. Now, this wasn't some beat-up old car. It was a 2001 Japanese-made model, built solid. You still see them on the roads today. So, to say I was in shock would be an understatement. I sat there, staring at the dashboard, trying to wrap my head around what just happened. Before I could even process what was happening, I heard it, loud bangs on the rear window. My heart stopped, and I whipped my head around to look, but the snow was coming down hard, and the darkness outside swallowed everything. I couldn't see a damn thing. As I squinted through the snow and darkness, my breath catching in my throat, I saw them. Handprints, faint but unmistakable, pressed against the back window. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew without a doubt that someone, or something, was out there. The silence was deafening. It felt like the entire world had stopped moving. Just as I was about to calm myself down, trying to listen more carefully, I heard it, a sharp jangle of metal as someone tried to open the passenger door. My heart skipped. Thankfully, it was locked. I didn't want to look, but I knew I had no choice. Slowly, I turned to the passenger window, but when I looked, there was no one out there. I sat there in the driver's seat, frozen in disbelief at what was happening. My mind raced trying to make sense of it all. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it, the most horrifying scream I've ever heard. To this day, it's the worst sound I can remember. It's burned into my memory, and I can't shake it, no matter how hard I try. Then the car started shaking violently, rattling as if something was trying to tear it apart. I still couldn't see who or what was outside, but I knew I had to get out of there. I prayed desperately and slammed my hand down on the ignition. It took a few tries, but finally, the engine roared. Without thinking twice, I slammed the gas pedal and tore off down the road, not daring to look back, not wanting to know what, or who, had been trying so damn hard to get to me. I finally made it to my parents' house, barely even greeting them before mumbling that I was extremely tired. In truth, I was too ashamed to tell them what had happened. I went straight to bed, hoping that everything, every terrifying moment, was just a bad hallucination brought on by stress. But when I woke up the next morning, all doubts were erased. There they were, those massive handprints still smeared across the back window of my car. Now, every time I find myself on Clinton Road, I don't hesitate. I speed through it as fast as I can, eyes straight ahead, never daring to look out the windows. Whatever I encountered that night, whatever was out there, I don't ever want to face it again. A Teenage Nightmares original series.